welcome to EPCC Talks. It's wonderful to be with you again. We are here yet again at another podcast, and we're so excited today because we do have a special guest. My name is Dr. Amber Archuleta, faculty member teaching government at EPCC, and of course my co-host,
Claudia Chacon, faculty member as well, teaching history at EPCC.
And the special guest that we have is Dr. Scott Abernathy from the University of Minnesota. We're excited about having Dr. Abernathy here, as he is a well-accomplished author, has a wonderful resume. But the reason that we're here today, as with all of our podcasts, is that we're interested in the narrative. We're interested in an individual's personal journey, how they got from point A to point B in their academic, their social, their personal trajectory. So let me welcome Dr. Abernathy to the podcast. And we're excited that you're here in El Paso. We're excited that you're going to spend an evening with us, not only here at the podcast, but we have an evening event tonight. And so welcome on behalf of Claudia and I and EPCC in El Paso, Texas. We're so happy that you're here, Dr. Abernathy.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me down here. I really appreciate it. Everyone's been so welcoming. It's great to be back in Texas. Again, I'm from Texas, Fort Worth. And it's not only great because it was 15 up in Minneapolis this morning, but no, it's nice to be back, and it's great to be here. So thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Let me start by talking maybe a little bit about your background. And as I told you as we were walking, I didn't want this to be so resume and CV oriented, right? I know you do that a lot, but I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach and angle. So if you can just indulge Claudia and I, can you talk a little bit about maybe some highlights in terms of your very early childhood, educational journey, maybe going back to elementary school, but more or less, tell us a little bit about the geography, where you grew up and moving into your early schooling.
Okay, great. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. Lived there with a little stint in Calgary. Well, it was, much of it was great, but also it was, 1970s in Fort Worth. It was a very divided place, and that I never really knew why. Often as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, but it did stick. But lots of wonderful experiences. I think most fondly remember the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History. I collected moths and butterflies, and we would travel around looking for insects and reptiles and such. And I think it was just the discovery was fun. That really instilled kind of just that science is cool and discovery is cool and enjoyable. So I think that definitely comes to mind. With that, and a place to be home, a place where I felt okay, and it was okay to be me and be a super nerd, and that was not, because Fort Worth in the 70s, I wasn't a football player and such, so it was nice. I think just finding a home and other people who got me understood, and we understood each other. That really, I think about that mattered a lot, and finding that space and that place that it was okay.
One of the things I like to kind of probe into is just as you started your early schooling and thinking about what that means to the individual that you are today, right? Sitting before us with an author and a well-accomplished individual. How was how did you understand, or what support did you get maybe from your parents, siblings, and or other people, teachers, as you moved through your early schooling?
Yeah. I definitely, my parents, but also my grandparents, especially up in Sand Springs, Oklahoma, near Tulsa. And some memory I have that is so vivid at the time is that relatives and neighbors, many of whom I didn't know, would come to Grandma's house and what they called visit. Just come and visit. And it was a time, again, I didn't conceptualize it that way when I was growing up, but a time of storytelling. It really wasn't. I had no idea what they were talking about most of the time, or who the protagonists, who the individuals were in the narrative, but it was such a sense of belonging, and a place and connection when they would come in, and just it was the news of the week and the day. That was something very special for me. Then my grandma and my mom would just kind of let me sit over there in the corner and just be.
Tell me a little bit about you're at Fort Worth, you're at an elementary school, you're navigating probably through the middle school. That experience at school in terms of your peers, in terms of your maybe understanding of what an education is, what it means, what it can mean potentially later in your life. What did that look like for you?
To get a sense of how powerful it can be, and I think that definitely drove part of this book is that, and especially, that sense of belonging in the learning and the storytelling, that definitely shaped me in that sense of, for me, honestly, studying in books and things was a kind of a place of refuge for me, and I wasn't popular or anything like that, and still a nerd, always a nerd. And so sometimes I would just lose myself in stories and reading, and I felt calm and at home, in reading a story or watching a story. And so looking back at the time, I didn't think that, but now kind of reflecting, that's always been a place where I'm happy,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Claudia and I have talked about this before. I mentioned before in a previous podcast, I wasn't the greatest student, but I loved school. I loved learning, just, the saturation of all of that. When you got to high school and you started to think about maybe furthering your education, what did that look like? What did that jump look like from maybe your high school to considering college? And I don't know if, there were considerations going out of the country or just staying in the, state of Texas. What did that look like for you, those choices?
Staying in the country, I think that especially my dad had different expectations than I did. It was sort of more career kind of thing, and I went off to college in New Hampshire and started kind of a long, as I mentioned on our way in, it's not a linear story with cause and effect, and just some of it's chance, some of it sort of take, but really kind of just discovering the world. I hadn't really, seen the world. And so for me, it was Asia, studying Chinese in Asia, and then I sort of volunteered for a few months in Calcutta, and that just changed everything. It was like not even knowing that something was possible, and then finding out that it was possible. And so it didn't really take me into the business world. There was a little not conflict, well, maybe a little conflict on that, but. It was just once, I sort of started down that path and no going back.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, Dr. Sainz Rivera, and I were, of course, looking at your resume, and we found out that, of course, you were in Calcutta with, the order and stuff like that. And if you can share with us just a little bit of how, you mentioned how it changed you, how you processed and maybe considered
it was a short time. Elements. It was only a few months. I was home for the dying, and sort of looking. At the time, and this is honest, this is true. I felt kind of useless, and it was kind of like I wish I'd have been a nurse or something. The work obviously was important, but it kind of realizing, if one wants to really do something, and that why come over here to do it? I'm not just, I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity, but also it's like, well, go back to New Hampshire and maybe do something. So I did, and then I did hospice volunteer work in New Hampshire, and then I started working as a tutor with incarcerated young men in Manchester, New Hampshire, tutor of English, and that's really what hooked me on education. Because I felt like it's not for experience or going different places. It's like this is the work I love, and that hooked me.
Yeah,
absolutely. I didn't become a teacher right away, but definitely.
Yeah.
I think.
No, I'm picking up on that vein. I know Claudia has some things that she wanted to ask you, and hopefully, we can delve into your valuable insight.
I did when I was reading your background.
I haven't read it, so
say,
I'm not sure what's in there,
well,
but that's okay. You
well,
can surprise me. Sorry.
You'd be surprised. No, it's actually very, it's very positive. At least that's the way I saw it. I remember reading a label there, and I wasn't sure if it was the author that called you this or you did. You were labeled the street worker.
Oh, right.
Can you share
yeah,
something
no,
about
I can
that?
imagine, yes, and I can see that was, if there's anything that I had the chance to do that changed my life, it was that. So I was officially, this was right out of college, didn't have a job when I graduated, and knew I wanted to, didn't have a teaching license either, so I wanted to do something, and kind of stumbled on it in Boston. It was Bridge Over Troubled Water, so I was a street outreach counselor, an on-street counselor, but street worker is what everyone called us, and we called ourselves. So it was outreach with the homeless communities in Boston, and then finding, working with homeless youths, identifying. I worked mostly, primarily, because I was young and kind of young looking, with runaways, and then also young men involved in sex work. Those were probably the two populations I worked with the most. So I was basically, we had a medical van that we drove around Boston to give medical service to homeless people of all ages, and there were volunteer doctors and nurses from Boston City Hospital and such. Part of the job was to drive that, but most of the time was just walking around, and there are known communities where different homeless communities, and so I become known. We were viewed as very harmless, which was good, and my job was to kind of identify and connect with homeless youths, build a very basic relationship, and then bring them to the bridge, and they're still there. Bridge Over, and their van is still there. It was a nonprofit, non-religious, multi-service counseling, substance abuse counseling, sexual abuse counseling, GED, dental. That was very popular with the young people. Medical, and so my job was to connect them with a counselor and then back off, because I'm just out there kind of wandering around.
Okay, I see what that kind of.
And so that title, I know kids see, but that's what we were known as, and what the homeless communities called us, and we kind of called ourselves.
Right, so you were the connection between the people and the system.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a very thoughtful way to put it. Yeah.
Well, and you need that person, you need that channel many times. Besides doing this, I'm a first responder, and sometimes the calls are they're very, very heavy, and not to go into detail, but many times we've dealt with certain people that leads me to question what drove that person towards that specific decision. And it seems like many times some of them will talk about their childhood and their lack of education. What do you think? Because I've asked actually some of my crew, what do you think? And then a lot of them say, it has to do with the low education, low income, the presence of the parents. What did you find? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we thought a lot about this at the time, and since we worked with first responders and interacted, so that's important work. If you're a homeless adolescent and in physical health is okay. One can survive in terms of food and such, and so there's a lot of it is boring for them, to be honest, punctuated by violence often, and probably, and so we obviously talked to the kids a lot, and they actually did a survey like a month before I got there. Trauma, I think, especially for the but again, the specific population that I worked with was the young. I worked with the young women. The woman who trained me to street work, Ellen, she worked with primarily the young women sex workers, and I worked with the young men sex workers. There was some, quite a bit of that, and though my relationship, they was not supposed to really have the young people open up to me and such. It was sort of just a basic level of trust that it's all right to kind of go into the center, and and it's safe to do that. So I wouldn't have a lot of them. That was one of the kind of the challenges of being a street outreach counselor is you meet and in a short space of time, young people with amazing and wonderful and terrible stories all kind of thrown into one, and then never kind of know what happened to them afterwards. Education, for sure. I think I noted that when I was working with the young people in the youth prison, that it's a cyclical thing, as I'm sure you know, right? That reading difficulties can lead to behavior outbursts with the T, and it kind of feeds on itself. So that was a common denominator, was having struggled especially with reading, and then having the school or the system respond in a certain way, and kind of that cycle.
So I got to ask you, your family, right? Your support systems at home. You're telling them, listen, I'm doing all this outreach work. I'm doing this often, it's misconstrued. People don't understand. What was that reaction like?
Yeah, they worry, a lot of worry. I didn't talk about it a lot, and I mean, obviously there were times, that are in the moment quite challenged, but on most of the time, the biggest challenge was the need and the emptiness, I think, and the sort of the emotional void and challenge that. So often I probably kind of shielded them from that. They didn't really know what I was doing, and
Yes.
then they thought, well, maybe he'll move on to something
He'll grow
else.
out of it.
It wasn't their dream for me. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
That makes complete sense because sometimes you just don't want to bring that home
Yeah.
because they're going to be fearful for your life.
Sure. No, absolutely.
Because you do expose yourself to many things, right? But I was wondering when amongst the things that I read, what was the cultural shock when you went from, it said that, you went from going from Princeton, all of a sudden you're in the streets. So was there a time of adjustment?
Yeah, undergrad was after undergrad. The Princeton was grad school, but it was
Okay.
but your point's well taken. It was. I mean, I remember, walking around the streets of Boston doing my thing and looking up at all those fancy law buildings and things, and classmates of mine were working up there. And sometimes I'd encounter them on the street and they just kind of ignore me. They probably didn't recognize me but the divide. I mean, it definitely felt like a divide. I mean, and one can get all self-righteous, but I didn't. It was mostly just like, it was just a real like, wow, there's so much gap or space
There is.
between these two worlds, and trying to process how does that happen and such. That was, I think, more that, the idea of the divide really for me was that. It's a great question.
How does that happen? Because I've asked myself that too. I go from academia and then all of a sudden I'm out on the streets dealing with people that have many types of issues, and sometimes I ponder there and I go into the truck and think, how did this happen?
How did this happen? Though I left it, now I'm in academia, which is a much safer thing, and so I think, how did that happen?
Right.
But, I mean, there's Calcuttas everywhere in the world, if only you have eyes to see. That's what
True.
Mother Teresa had said.
Your
True.
time at Princeton, as you navigated your master's degree and moved through this doctorate, right? Was it? I'm just curious in terms of your thinking, the changes, the evolution of the humanness of what we share. What did that look like from you, having all these very rich experiences? Many times, like you said, the disconnect from your probably more affluent colleagues and classmates, and now you have all of this wholeness coming to a master's and a doctorate. How did you piece that together? What did that look like?
Well, I had one big change, and I'm a wife and I have two kids, and so our first son, Russell, he was born my first year of graduate school, so that changed into the PhD program, and so that put things in perspective right quick, which was, it was a great place to have a kid, and we lived in the graduate student housing for people with kids and dependents, which was just wonderful, actually. I think that was literally had this, 6 foot, 8 foot high wood fence around it to kind of protect the neighborhood from us. I think but it was just fantastic. His his friends, the languages spoken, and it was neat. I miss that. I really do. The graduate student with the kid, the little housing compound that's torn down now. I've heard. I haven't been back, but so I mean that obviously gets you thinking. Oh, I better finish school and all that. But it really, then it was obviously profound, and he had a pretty difficult birth, and so just the blessings and and try to take it in and not just be focused on grad school, but that happens too.
One of the things that Claudia and I have tried to accomplish with this podcast is sort of connecting our guests to our students, right? So you're here at El Paso Community College. You're here in El Paso, and we're so glad that you're here. This region has its own unique challenges, and it's a wonderful. I've been here 14 years this year, originally from Denver, and it's been a wonderful journey as I've gotten to understand and really love this community. I'm curious in terms of your experience, your expertise, your knowledge, all the things that you've brought to us today. What would you share with a typical community college student, an individual of course, this particular region, maybe 87.7% Latino, right? What would you share with a typical student in today, 2019, fast forward political and economic and social navigation that they have to, move through?
Yeah. First off, congrats for hanging in there. I mean, I think there's so many challenges for young adults and young people today. Just keep questioning. Just and be confident in the validity of this place that your questioning comes from. I think I've doubted myself, and obviously, very different lived experience and stuff. But I think we all doubt ourselves sometimes, or at least many of us do. About, are my questions good questions? And so I think that's part of it. Our good starting place, is that always, the Zen mind, beginner's mind kind of thing. Always be a beginner, and that's easy for me because there's always something I don't know anything about. But I think that start from that place if one can. But of course, there's the world and reality and such too. But if one can, that just that hold to that your questions matter, and your voice that asks those questions matters. I think.
Yeah, I think Claudia and I often say that in class. You have a place at the table of decision making. You may not see that because you lack a degree or you lack a geographical area where you think has maybe been overlooked, but your place at the table does matter.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No. That's
I mean, we're talking sort of in class talking about power and such, and you say that the most sort of egregious or one of the most powerful uses of power is to encourage people to think that they're powerless, right? And so I think that when power structures and those in power structures and such, and the policies encourage us to think of ourselves as powerless, that's a very dangerous use of power. And I think to help remind that it's not just okay to challenge that, it's what we're born to do, that in whatever way we can, small art, and such.
Absolutely. I wanted to maybe loop back around. You're here with us tonight. I mean, your book is driven. This is Dr. Abernathy's book. I had to bring it.
I'm still afraid to read it. It's so scary.
It is driven by the thing that Claudia and I have been attempting to do. Is this narrative, right? Stories of a nation. How we weave all that together. As we loop back around and we're thinking about some of the maybe challenges young people have, as we kind of started on that particular vein. What would you advise maybe a younger Scott Abernathy to do? Fast forward 2019, if you were growing up right now, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Be bolder. Realize that all the bad things I think are going to happen, it's probably going to be something I never thought of in the first place that's going to come. And confident. I've always been confident in my voice and in my and such. And so, but to hold to that are the stories. It's it's the love and passion and stuff that makes the stories valid, not how many people read them or how famous the people are in them. I guess. I mean, it sounds kind of hokey, but I think it's true.
Yeah, one of our first podcasts, Claudia, right? December of last year, we had 2 students sharing very intimate, very powerful stories. Brian and Giselle.
I saw that.
And we walked away with that, and Claudia and I walked away with that, and we were thinking, there's such a richness to and connection between all of us, right? No matter if you're coming from Princeton, if you're coming from Denver, if you're coming from New Mexico, there's this place that all of us share. And so on behalf of Claudia and I just wanted to sincerely thank you, welcome you first to El Paso. And let me say that, I know Claudia will wrap up. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of El Paso Community College, on behalf of the community in general. We're so grateful that you're here. We're looking forward to this evening. We're looking forward to the talk. We're happy that we were able to share this space with you, and your place in this community matters. So thank you, Scott, for coming tonight.
thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
an honor. It really is.
No, thank
Sorry.
you. No, that's okay. Thank you for coming and sharing your story. I think it's very important to all of us, especially after reading. It's different when you read a piece of paper
Absolutely.
and you meet the person. It's great. And then not only can we put a person to our paper, but also for everything else that you shared. Like I said, I read a couple of your things, and I always wonder. I wonder what type of person he is. And I'm glad to see that you're very down to earth. You're more than willing to share what you found. And thank you so much for sharing that wealth. I always say share the wealth.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. It's just, it's cool. Thanks for having
And
me
thank
down
you for all
here.
those years of community service.
it's
I think
small
that's very
time,
important too. Sometimes we forget to thank those people that are like you,
Yeah.
down
Mhm.
on the, where most people tend
Absolutely.
to run away from. No, there
Yeah.
you were,
Mm-hmm.
helping make connections.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And it's
Yeah.
made you the person who you are.
It has,
Awesome.
Okay.
for sure.
So on behalf of El Paso Community College and EPCC Talks, we'd like to go ahead and thank Dr. Abernathy, thank my co-host Claudia. It's always a pleasure to be with you all. We look forward to many more podcasts, and thank you and goodbye.